No door, no cracks. Still, someone whispered. Welcome to Mystery's Notebook. I am your host, Elspeth. Where are you solving mysteries from? Tell me below. Hearing from you makes this story complete. Let's begin. It began, as many troubles do in the village of Lower Bramblecombe, with a misunderstanding over marmalade. Mrs. Sylvia Caxton, brisk and bespectacled, had arrived 10 minutes early to the Saint. Mildred's church hall that Thursday morning, armed with a basket of jars that rattled ominously. The air inside the hall was heavy with the mingled scents of starch, lemon polish, and slightly musty hymnals. Outside, the hedges stood neat and clipped beneath a low autumn sun, and the village looked on as calm and ancient as a sleeping cat. Nothing ever truly happened here, or at least, not on the surface. Miss Jane Marple had taken her usual place in the second pew, not because she was religiously fervent, but because she liked to observe the small interactions that occurred before the Mothers' Circle meetings began. She had a knitted shawl draped over her shoulders and a notebook peeking from her handbag, though it was more for crossword solutions than anything more sinister. Her eyes, sharp, pale blue, and far more perceptive than anyone tended to assume, moved gently from face to face. The disagreement over the marmalade began between Mrs. Caxton and Miss Beryl Lonscombe, an unmarried woman of indeterminate age who kept bees, cats, and grudges. It started with a comment on the tartness of Sylvia's preserves and ended in an accidental upset of a jam-laden trestle table that sent a dozen jars crashing to the floor in a sticky, glittering mess. "Oh, don't be so childish, Beryl," Sylvia had snapped, dabbing her cardigan with a lace handkerchief. "If you wanted your orange peel thinner, you might have entered your own batch." "Better no marmalade than one with vinegar in its soul," Beryl hissed, glaring over her spectacles. "Ladies," Mrs. Amelia Featherstone, chairwoman of the circle and part-time organist, fluttered her hands in the air. "We are all here to raise funds for the new parish roof, not to bicker over breakfast condiments." From her pew, Miss Marple clicked her knitting needles softly together. "Marmalade," she murmured to no one in particular, "is rather like truth. Best served with patience and not too much sugar." No one quite knew what she meant, but then again, most people seldom did. She had that curious ability to sound vague while saying something rather specific. By the time the vicar arrived with a modest tray of scones, the incident was dismissed with polite smiles and a great deal of loud, slightly over-eager laughter. But the atmosphere had shifted. Little things mattered in Lower Bramblecombe. They lingered like the smell of furniture polish or the echo of a church bell through fog. That afternoon, the vicar's wife, Mrs. Isabel Trowbridge, insisted on hosting tea for Miss Marple and Mrs. Caxton as a means of smoothing over the tension. The sitting room at the vicarage was cheerful, if a touch faded, with a fire burning low and an upright piano bearing a vase of exhausted carnations. "I do hope we can put this unpleasantness behind us," Isabel said, pouring tea with a steady hand and a nervous smile. "It's been ages since the circle had such enthusiasm." "I agree entirely," Sylvia said tightly, "although one wonders what sort of mind goes about whispering insults through stone walls." Miss Marple raised her head slightly. "Whispers?" Sylvia waved a hand. "Oh, nothing. Just a silly notion. Beryl's been complaining about someone muttering outside her window late at night. She says the sound comes through the brick. Honestly, I think she reads too many ghost stories." "But it wasn't only Beryl," Isabel added quickly. "Mrs. Harriman said she heard something last week as well. Low voices behind the garden wall. Thought it was burglars at first. You know how these country burglaries have been in the papers." "Ah," said Miss Marple, setting her cup down with the faintest clink. "Voices behind walls. One always wonders whether the walls are truly the barrier or the amplifier." The two women blinked, unsure how to respond, and the subject was quietly changed to the quality of scone flour at the local grocer's. That evening, the village was wrapped in a hush that felt heavier than usual. Perhaps it was the approaching fog that seemed to muffle sound and blur the outlines of the hedgerows. Or perhaps it was something more intangible, The quiet had a pressure to it, like a held breath. At the edge of the village, in a house partially covered in ivy and half lost beneath a spreading beech tree, Miss Beryl Lonscombe sat in her parlour, sorting dead bees into a tin tray. She did this not out of morbidity, but in order to chart the odd seasonal patterns of her hives. It was an old habit. Outside, the wind stirred the leaves, and inside the room there was only the gentle tick of the mantel clock. Then, quite suddenly, a sound, faint, low, and unmistakably human. A whisper, barely audible, seemed to drift in from behind the fireplace wall, muffled, as if shaped by lips too close to stone. Beryl rose, rigid, the tray slipping from her hands and scattering lifeless bees across the carpet. "Who's there?" she demanded, stepping back, her voice quivering not with fear, but fury. Silence, nothing but the crackle of settling logs and the wind hissing at the window panes. She stood still for nearly a full minute before retrieving her torch and marching outside. She circled the house, scouring every bush and corner of the crumbling garden wall. But she saw nothing, heard nothing more. No footsteps in the gravel, no rustling beyond the hedge. Just as she turned to head back inside, she noticed it, a faint, dark smear along the base of the brick wall near the old rosebush. Something too dark for soil and too irregular for paint. In the morning, it was Constable Jerry Purvis who found her. The call came from the milkman who had spotted the side gate hanging open and Beryl lying in the frost-rimmed garden, a single gardening glove clenched in her hand. She was quite dead. "Natural causes, probably," Purvis muttered, puffing on his pipe as the village doctor examined her. "Too much jam rage, if you ask me." "Strange," the doctor murmured, frowning as he packed his case. "I'd say her heart gave out. But the expression on her face—" "Yes?" asked Miss Marple softly, who had arrived, on the pretext of bringing over a jar of elderflower jelly. "It's not fear," the doctor said slowly, "but surprise. As though she'd seen something quite unexpected, or heard it." Miss Marple nodded once and looked out over the garden where ivy grew thick over crumbling brick. "A whisper," she said gently, "can be louder than a scream if you know what to listen for." And with that, she turned back toward the gate, already watching, already knowing, already listening. The morning after Miss Beryl Lonscombe's sudden and mystifying death, the village of Lower Bramblecombe hummed with restrained energy. Word spread quickly, as it always did, rushing through the post office queue, winding into conversations over fresh loaves at the baker's, whispered from bicycle to bicycle between schoolboys with more curiosity than tact. Miss Marple, who had returned home the previous evening with a single glove-shaped impression in her thoughts, sat at her breakfast table in her rose-chintz sitting room. She read the local newspaper with a cup of black tea cooling at her side, but her eyes were not on the words. They moved instead to the window, where a crow pecked methodically at something invisible along the garden wall. Dr. Crawford had listed the cause of Beryl's death as heart failure, an unsuspicious term in a woman of her age. But Miss Marple, who had seen enough faces stilled by death to note the subtle difference between peaceful departure and something altogether less settled, thought otherwise. There had been no sign of struggle, no wound, no indication of foul play in the traditional sense. But Beryl's expression, fixed even in death, had shown a peculiar kind of recognition, as if she had, in her final moment, understood something too late. By 10 o'clock, the village was already rehearsing its theories. The most popular included a long-standing feud with Sylvia Caxton, whose marmalade tantrum had taken on ominous tones in retrospect, and the rather pitiful suggestion that Beryl had simply frightened herself to death with her own wild tales of whispering walls. Miss Marple, for her part, had already begun her quiet work, not of investigating in any formal way, but of arranging visits, engaging in soft conversation, and observing the little fractures that opened in people when they were uneasy. Her first stop was to the vicarage, not to inquire about the death directly, but under the guise of returning a borrowed hymnal, an edition printed in 1899, which she said she had mistaken for her own. "I can't say we were close, poor Beryl and I," Isabel Trowbridge admitted as she took the book into her lap. "But it's still rather unsettling, isn't it? To go like that, alone in the garden, the gate hanging open." "The back gate?" Miss Marple asked mildly, stirring her tea. Isabel nodded, eyes flicking toward the window. "Yes, though it's rarely used. Jerry said it looked as though she'd gone out there in some kind of hurry." "Unusual, isn't it, to garden in the evening?" Miss Marple mused. "Particularly with frost setting in. I imagine it would make one's fingers rather stiff." "I suppose she might have heard something," Isabel replied. "Or someone." Miss Marple gave the faintest smile. "Yes, that would explain her glove, wouldn't it?" Later, as she walked down the village lane toward the high brick wall that bordered Beryl's overgrown garden, Miss Marple allowed herself a small moment of reflection. It was not that she had deduced anything yet. Rather, she had noticed things that did not sit quite right. The missing second glove, for instance, the damp smear of something dark, possibly blood, possibly oil, near the rose bush, which Constable Purvis had dismissed as nothing. And now the mention of the gate. If Beryl had indeed heard something and gone to investigate, why had she not brought a torch? And why had the whisper returned at all? Approaching the low hedge that bordered Sylvia Caxton's property, Miss Marple saw Sylvia herself crouched over her prized fuchsias, pruning with uncharacteristic violence. "I'm terribly sorry to intrude," Miss Marple said softly, as if startled by her own presence. Sylvia turned with a sharp glance that quickly softened into practiced civility. "Miss Marple, no intrusion at all, though I do expect the flowers will be somewhat embarrassed by your seeing them in such a state." "On the contrary," Miss Marple said, examining a particularly battered bloom. "They strike me as being remarkably honest in their exhaustion." Sylvia gave a clipped laugh, straightening her gloves. "If you're here about the jam debacle, I assure you it was nothing." "Jam? Oh no." Miss Marple's voice was light. "I was merely wondering if you happened to see anything unusual last evening, perhaps while tending your floral guests." Sylvia hesitated, her mouth tightening. "No, nothing. Well, nothing useful, anyway. I thought I heard a sound around dusk. I assumed it was the wind. There's a sort of moaning that comes through the trees sometimes." "Did it sound like a voice?" Sylvia looked at her carefully. "It might have. A sort of low murmur, but I didn't see anyone." "And how is your husband's hearing these days?" Miss Marple asked, brushing an imaginary leaf from her sleeve. "Henry?" Sylvia blinked. "Quite terrible. Why?" "Oh, no reason," Miss Marple replied pleasantly. "Only that sometimes, when we hear something inexplicable, it's useful to confirm whether it was heard alone or in company. Shared perception, after all, is a curious thing." Miss Marple let the moment sit, and then politely took her leave. As she walked back toward the lane, her path took her by the old blacksmith's cottage, now converted into a holiday let owned by the Harpers, though it was rarely rented in colder months. Miss Marple paused briefly at the side wall, the same wall that backed onto Beryl's garden. She ran her gloved hand over the brick surface. Old walls whispered in more ways than one. The next call she made was to Mrs. Harriman, a prim, ferret-faced woman who had lived in the village for decades and made it her business to know everyone else's. "Voices," Mrs. Harriman said when prompted. "Yes, heard them plain as day, or rather plain as fog, I should say, a few nights ago, coming from the other side of the wall. I thought it might be boys. You know, mischief. But they weren't laughing. What were they doing?" Mrs. Harriman's eyes narrowed as she recalled it. Whispering, not urgently, but careful-like, as if they didn't want to be overheard but weren't truly frightened of being found. Miss Marple gave a gentle nod. "And you mentioned it to anyone?" "Just Isabel, and Jerry, when he came to look at Beryl. But they didn't seem to think it meant much. Might not, I suppose." "It might," Miss Marple said gently. You've always had a keen ear, Mrs. Harriman. That evening, while the rest of Lower Bramblecombe locked their doors early and shared anxious cups of tea behind tightly drawn curtains, Miss Marple sat alone in her parlour, notebook open. She had not written in it yet. Instead, she held a thin strip of white thread between her fingers, winding it around a sewing needle without looking. It wasn't just the whispers, or the garden gate, or the glove, or even the dark smear on the wall. It was something else, something she'd only noticed when she'd looked up at Beryl's house from across the garden. The chimney had no smoke, the hearth cold, which meant Beryl hadn't lit a fire that evening, which meant she had gone outside wearing gloves, yes, but not because it was cold indoors. She had been expecting to go somewhere, or meet someone, and now Beryl Lonscombe was dead, the second glove still missing. Miss Marple finally picked up her pen and wrote 4 words on the first line of the page. Too much to hear. She paused, then added, but not enough said. And as she reached for her shawl and extinguished the lamp, a gust of wind rattled the panes, and for the briefest moment she thought she heard something outside her own window, a whisper, or just the sound of a secret shifting behind brick. The following morning in Lower Bramblecombe dawned still and slate-grey, the kind of morning that encouraged quiet voices and watchful glances from lace-curtained windows. Life carried on, as it always did, but not quite in the usual rhythm. The baker's chimes rang at 9:30, but no one lingered outside with their bread. The postmistress placed letters in pigeonholes with more care than usual. Children passed the garden where Beryl Lonscombe had been found with quickened steps, as if expecting the whisper to find a new listener. At the corner of Church Lane, Miss Marple sat in the small front room of the Harpers' converted blacksmith's cottage, her knitting laid neatly in her lap. Mrs. Harper had invited her for tea, but Miss Marple had only sipped once. Her attention was fixed, gently but firmly, on the story being told. Well, it's really not our business what she did in her garden, said Mrs. Harper, dabbing her nose. Beryl was eccentric. Everyone knows that. Bees and vinegar and those ghastly novels she wrote under a man's name. Really, Jane, she used to walk barefoot in the grass at night. In October. I understand, Miss Marple murmured. Though I confess, I've always thought people's eccentricities were often their most honest qualities. Bare feet are seldom dishonest. Mrs. Harper gave her a narrow glance. You've always had a fondness for oddities. They do tend to tell the truth when they're not trying to. You don't think she, that she did it to herself? Died deliberately? Miss Marple's eyebrows rose faintly. No, I don't, and I suspect she didn't either. One rarely brings gloves if one intends to leave the world. Mrs. Harper fidgeted, then said, as if against her better judgment, There was someone renting the room next door last week. A young man, quiet type. Said he was an architectural surveyor. He was out most nights. Said he was walking the village paths to study old brickwork by torchlight. A bit strange, but they're all like that. These countryside scholars. Always poking into things. Miss Marple's eyes glinted. Did he stay the night Beryl passed away? Number left 2 nights earlier. Very sudden. Paid cash and vanished without so much as a thank you. And what did he say he was surveying? Mrs. Harper squinted, thinking. Something about sound-carrying patterns in historical structures. Claimed Lower Bramblecombe had unusual acoustic qualities. Nonsense, if you ask me. Did he mention the garden wall? Now that you say it, yes. He asked whether it was original, said the mortar looked pre-war. I thought he was just trying to sound clever. Miss Marple sat back, fingers resting lightly on her knitting. People are often clever in ways they don't announce, and often foolish in ways they can't conceal. She left the Harpers with a polite smile and a great deal to think about. A young man, nosing, around old brick, interested in acoustics, who disappeared days before Beryl died from fright or revelation. Someone interested in how sound travels, someone who might know that a whisper in the right place could be heard clearly through old stone. especially if there were old chimneys or cavities in the wall. Miss Marple made her way slowly through the village, not because she was tired, but because she knew that the village noticed slow things more easily. Fast movement passed through unnoticed. Slow movement drew conversation. She stopped near the green where Constable Purvis was speaking with the vicar, his notebook out and his brow furrowed in theatrical concern. "Morning, Miss Marple," Purvis said with a nod. "Out for your usual?" "I do like to see the village while it's still pretending to be peaceful," she said. "Is there news?" "Not much," the vicar replied, "though Jerry here tells me that the Harper's lodger never signed the guest book. No surname, no return address. Unusual." "Not so unusual if he was nervous," Miss Marple said. "And nervousness often accompanies guilt, or fear, or both." "Do you think he had something to do with it?" the vicar asked. "I think it very odd," she replied softly, "that a man studying acoustics should arrive shortly before a woman starts hearing whispers, and then leaves before she dies mysteriously." Constable Purvis straightened a little, trying not to look like he'd missed something. "We'll look into it. It could be coincidence." "Of course," Miss Marple said, and smiled kindly. "But coincidence is a thing that happens to people who aren't paying attention." That evening, she attended a small gathering at Amelia Featherstone's home, a post-circle tea repurposed into something more somber. The women of the village gathered with quiet voices and serious brows. Sylvia Caxton sat a little too stiffly in the corner, sipping from a cup she hadn't refilled. Mrs. Harriman murmured beside the biscuit tray, and Isabel Trowbridge kept her hands folded tightly in her lap. Miss Marple didn't say much. She listened to the slight tremor in Sylvia's voice when Beryl's name was mentioned. Noticed the way Mrs. Harriman kept glancing at the mantel clock. Observed that when the subject of the voice behind the wall came up, Isabel's eyes darted not toward the speaker, but toward the back hallway, as if recalling something. Only once did Miss Marple speak directly. "Have any of you," she asked gently, "ever tried standing behind the fireplace in the church hall, where the plaster peels a bit? If one listens very carefully while someone speaks at the front, the words come through quite plainly. It's a matter of cavity and stone." There was silence. Then Sylvia set down her teacup with a clink. "Really, Miss Marple, I don't think now is the time for architectural trivia." "I'm sure you're right," Miss Marple replied, all mildness. "It's just that I remembered a curious thing. When I passed Beryl's house the day after she died, I saw the faintest outline of a footprint in the mud by the side wall. Not a boot, a man's shoe, quite clean." Mrs. Harriman let out a sharp breath. "I thought I saw something too, but I convinced myself it was the gardener's." "Beryl had no gardener," Miss Marple said softly. "Just bees and suspicion." Later that night, as the women dispersed into the chill and their husbands waited with mufflers drawn high, Miss Marple took a longer route home. She passed the garden wall again, paused, and listened. Nothing. She walked around the far side, near the Harper's cottage, and found the low section where the brick had cracked. She leaned closer and spoke, not loudly, but with a clarity born of years in drawing rooms and parlours. "Who are you whispering to now?" And from the other side, far back among the ivy and shadows, something moved, a breath or a figure. She waited, and then, almost inaudibly, she heard a word. Not English, not clear, but familiar. She turned slowly and made her way back toward her gate. It was not the whisper itself that troubled her now. It was the kind of person who would use one, and the kind of person who would know precisely where to stand so that the words would travel through stone to reach someone's mind like a hand on the shoulder in the dark. The killer had not needed to strike. They had only needed to speak. And they had known Beryl would listen. The morning after Miss Marple had heard the whisper, that faint foreign syllable blooming softly from the ivy-laced wall, she stood in her garden preparing chrysanthemums for the church altar. The secateurs clicked steadily, each cut deliberate. Her mind, however, was not on flowers, but on the quiet malevolence that had threaded itself into the village, like ivy through old mortar, hidden until it began to crack the surface. It was not the first time someone in Lower Bramblecombe had used something subtle to frighten, nor the first time a fear had been nurtured deliberately. But this was something different. Not a passing quarrel or a matter of pride. This was studied, crafted, and it had ended in death. As she placed the flowers in her basket, a faint crunch of gravel alerted her to a visitor. She turned to find Reverend Trowbridge approaching along the path, hat in hand, the morning fog still lifting behind him. His kind face was drawn with concern. "Miss Marple," he said, dipping his head. "I wonder, might you walk with me to the vestry? There's something I believe you should see." She nodded and took her shawl. No further explanation was needed. The short walk to St. Mildred's passed in silence. They entered through the side door, the heavy oak groaning on its hinges, and the Reverend led her past the main aisle into the vestry, where a small table held the church's guest log. It was a modest book bound in cracked red leather, with names neatly inscribed in ink. "I was reviewing attendance," he said, "as I always do after committee meetings. This page," he turned it carefully, "was blank 3 days ago, and this morning it contains something I didn't write." Miss Marple leaned forward. A short entry had been added in small, tight handwriting. "Sound makes a liar of walls. Only truth echoes." It was unsigned. She studied it for a long moment. How curious and troubling. Reverend Trowbridge's voice was low. "I thought it might be the same hand as the Harper's mysterious lodger, though I confess I only glimpsed his writing once, on the rental envelope." "I believe you may be right," she murmured. "And it suggests something important. He's still here. Or has returned." The vicar looked alarmed. "But why would he? To listen, perhaps? Or to remind someone of what they heard?" She straightened and slowly closed the book. That afternoon, the fog lifted, and with it the illusion of calm. Amelia Featherstone's nephew, who worked for the county archive office, arrived in the village by bus and caused a stir by simply asking questions. He was a soft-spoken man in his 30s, with horn-rimmed glasses and an unfortunate moustache, and he spent much of the morning inspecting the old brick walls along Beryl Lonscombe's garden and the blacksmith's cottage. Miss Marple watched from the far side of the green, knitting needles still and idle in her lap. By early evening, she found herself at Sylvia Caxton's again, ostensibly to drop off a recipe for blackberry syllabub, though both women knew it was for something else entirely. Sylvia ushered her into the sitting room, tension clinging to her movements. "I've been expecting you, Jane." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Then you must already know what I'm going to say." Sylvia sat, fingers folding over one another in her lap. "No, but I imagine it won't be about the syllabub." Miss Marple inclined her head. "I was wondering, Sylvia, if your husband ever mentioned Beryl Lonscombe's writing." Sylvia blinked. "Beryl's writing? Good heavens! Number, I didn't think anyone even remembered that nonsense. She wrote under a pseudonym. What was it? Gerald Bain. Awful thrillers, all full of code words and whispers and suspicious gardeners." "Yes," Miss Marple said gently, "but quite successful once, weren't they? At least in certain literary circles." Sylvia hesitated. "What are you suggesting?" "That perhaps someone took more interest in Beryl's past than she realized. Someone who arrived pretending to be interested in bricks and sound. Someone who knew just enough about her books to know where to find her." Sylvia's lips tightened, but she didn't interrupt. "I believe your lodger was no surveyor," Miss Marple continued, "and I believe he never really left. He vanished to mislead us, certainly, but I think he's been here since, watching, perhaps hiding in one of the empty houses, or even the church." Sylvia rose sharply. "Jane, this is getting into fantasy." "Is it?" Miss Marple's voice remained calm, Then tell me, have you heard anything? At night? The whisper, perhaps? Sylvia stared at her for a long moment before looking away. Only once, 2 nights ago. I thought it was my imagination. It rarely is, in these matters, Miss Marple said gently. Fear invents monsters, but whispers, they must come from mouths. Sylvia sat back down, visibly shaken. That night, the village seemed even quieter than usual. Even the dogs did not bark. Miss Marple sat in her armchair by the fire, the chrysanthemums already arranged and placed at the front door. On her lap was a book, Whispers Beneath the Yew, by Gerald Bain. It had been long out of print, but she had kept a copy for years. It was Beryl's 3rd novel, and it featured a murderer who used acoustic tricks to torment his victim. There was a passage she had marked with a thread. The stone betrayed him. Every sound he whispered to haunt her heart came back to him magnified, exposing the hollow where secrets rot. Miss Marple read it again and closed the book slowly. It was not a confession, but it was close. She rose, set the book down, and took her shawl. The evening air had turned damp, and the roads gleamed faintly in the moonlight. She walked along the path to the church, past the hedgerows, until she reached the gate behind the vestry. There, by the wall, stood a figure, young, male, not local. He did not move when she approached. He merely looked at her, as though he had been expecting her all along. I suppose, he said, you're the one who listens. And you, she replied quietly, are the one who wanted to be heard. He smiled faintly. She recognized me, you know. That was the mistake. Miss Marple nodded slowly. You were her student once, long ago. She stopped writing because of what happened, because she suspected what you'd done, even then. He tilted his head. I only ever whispered the truth. No, she said softly. You whispered fear, and Beryl, clever as she was, wasn't strong enough to carry it. Not at her age, not when she thought the past had buried itself. He said nothing. The silence stretched, long and cold. Then, calmly, Miss Marple turned back toward the church and knocked at the vestry door. Reverend Trowbridge answered with surprise, but her words were quiet and firm. Would you be so good, she said, as to fetch Constable Purvis? I believe the man responsible for Beryl Lonscombe's death is standing behind the west wall, waiting for someone to listen to him confess. And in the stillness of that village night, even the walls seemed to lean closer. The arrival of Constable Purvis, lantern swinging in hand, broke the delicate stillness behind the church wall. The young man, the same one Miss Marple had confronted without raising her voice, did not run, nor did he protest. He stood with the fatal stillness of someone who had rehearsed the moment in his mind, long before it happened, as if capture were simply the final note of a quiet, malevolent composition. I didn't kill her, he said when Purvis stepped forward. I never touched her. Miss Marple, standing just beyond the reach of the lantern's glow, spoke gently. Number. But you frightened her deliberately, didn't you? The man's eyes shifted, but he didn't answer. She was an old woman, Miss Marple continued, not unkindly. Her heart had already grown frail, I imagine. But it wasn't a trick of health that finished her. It was the precision of your cruelty. You knew exactly where to stand, what to say, how it would carry through the old stones. You knew her fears. Constable Purvis's face was a mixture of discomfort and confusion. I don't know if this counts as murder. That's for the court, Miss Marple said, though I expect manslaughter is the more likely charge. In any case, there's another question to answer first. The young man's head snapped toward her. What question? Miss Marple met his eyes. Why? The pause stretched. Then, almost reluctantly, he began. She ruined him, he said softly. My father, she was his mentor. They said she lifted him up, but really she used him, took ideas from him, got him expelled from the academy. She buried the evidence, rewrote the story. He told me before he died. He never got over it. Miss Marple's voice remained calm. And so you came to Lower Bramblecombe, calling yourself an acoustic scholar, rented the blacksmith's cottage under cash and silence, all to frighten her. I just wanted her to hear what it felt like, to doubt your senses, to hear things you weren't supposed to be pulled apart from the inside out. She heard you, Miss Marple said, and now she never will again. The words hung heavy in the damp air. Behind the church, where ivy laced along the stones, the sound of an owl called once into the darkness, then fell silent. The young man was taken without resistance. Purvis walked him quietly toward the village station, where arrangements would be made with the regional constabulary. The formalities would follow, papers, statements, the slow machinery of law, but the heart of it, Miss Marple knew, had already happened. A cruelty, meticulously designed, had bloomed and closed like a night flower. And yet, even with the man's capture, something remained unsettled in her mind. As she returned home through the winding path along the vicarage wall, she paused by the spot where she'd heard the whisper. She placed her hand gently against the brick. It was cold now, indifferent. But memory clung to it like lichen. She returned home to find her fire had gone out. The embers glowed faintly in the grate, but the room was cold. She drew her shawl tighter around her shoulders, not from the chill, but from the echo still ringing faintly in her thoughts. The next morning, the village moved with cautious relief. Word had begun to spread, quietly, respectfully, that a suspect had been taken. Not officially charged, not yet, but questions had been answered. Or so it seemed. At the village shop, Mrs. Harriman stood beside the root vegetables, muttering to herself about evil always having an education and never quite enough sense. Sylvia Caxton walked past without meeting anyone's eyes. At the post office, the usual queue of 3 was now 5, purely because no one quite wanted to be the first to go home. And through it all, Miss Marple remained at her window, watching. Not triumphantly, not even with satisfaction, because something still clung to the edges of the picture. She sat down after lunch with her notebook, turning once again to the few observations she had marked in her tight, careful hand. There was the footprint, the smeared mark on the wall, the missing glove, but also the whisper she had heard herself, after the young man had already left. She'd assumed, in the fog of mystery and the weight of suspicion, that he had returned early, that he had been hiding nearby. But what if he hadn't? She had said as much to him in the churchyard, and he had not corrected her. But now she recalled it. He'd looked surprised when she said he'd been there the night Beryl died. Genuinely surprised. Not defensively, not craftily, simply confused, and then cautious. Which meant, perhaps, he hadn't been there. And if he hadn't whispered to Beryl that final night, who had? She sat back in her chair, fingers pressed together beneath her chin. Beryl had written thrillers under the name Gerald Bain, yes. And in those thrillers, there were patterns, characters with secrets, whispers in the dark. But always, there was someone overlooked, someone ordinary, someone dismissed. And suddenly, the detail leapt out at her, the marmalade, or rather, the quarrel over marmalade. That morning at the church hall, just before everything began. It hadn't been a quarrel, not truly. It had been a performance. Sylvia and Beryl arguing, Beryl dropping her jars, Sylvia's calculated venom dressed in domestic wit. But someone else had been there, quieter than the rest, sweeping up the glass, smoothing the edges. Isabel Trowbridge. Miss Marple rose quickly and fetched her coat. The feeling in her chest was not urgency, it was certainty. At the vicarage, Isabel received her with a polite smile and ushered her into the sitting room, where sunlight crept over the furniture in long yellow shafts. The vicar was out, she said, visiting a parishioner. Tea? No, thank you, Miss Marple replied gently. I came with a question, Isabel. One you may not wish to answer. Isabel's smile flickered. Of course. Miss Marple sat down, calmly, smoothing her skirt. Did you know about Beryl's writing? About Gerald Bain? A pause. A breath. I did, Isabel said softly. I read her books when I was younger. She never spoke of them, but I knew. You were a fan. She was brilliant, Isabel said, and something bright lit behind her eyes. Not just clever, truthful. Her books told the truth about people. She saw everything, but she stopped, and I thought that was wrong. And did you ever speak with her about it? Number she wouldn't have welcomed it. Miss Marple nodded slowly. So you found another way. You saw the young man arrive, saw his interest in her past, and you helped him, guided him. Perhaps you even whispered to her once or twice yourself, to prepare her, to prime the fear. Then the night he left, you decided it was your moment. Isabel looked down at her hands. She wasn't frightened of him, she said. She didn't recognize him, but she was frightened. I only said one word, that's all, through the old chimney flue. I knew she'd hear it. She was listening for it. Miss Marple's voice was quiet. What word? Isabel's voice cracked as she said it. Plagiarist. Miss Marple closed her eyes. The word was from Beryl's past, a shadow only she could see. She took everything from someone once, Isabel whispered. A woman like that doesn't just forget. I didn't want her to die. I only wanted her to remember what she was. Miss Marple opened her eyes. She did. The fire in the grate had gone out. The room felt suddenly cold. Isabel said nothing more. When the vicar returned, he found his wife seated silently with Miss Marple beside her. Neither woman spoke of the conversation again, and in the days that followed, the villagers of Lower Bramblecombe moved on, as they always did, briskly, politely, and without questions too deep for comfort. But Miss Marple, as she walked each morning past the garden walls, knew what had truly happened. Not one whisper, but two. One from a son seeking justice for a father, the other from someone much closer. Someone who had listened too long and finally spoken. And the walls, as always, had faithfully carried the truth. If only one knew how to listen. The days following Miss Marple's quiet visit to the vicarage passed with deceptive calm. Isabel Trowbridge resumed her place at the side of her husband, her face calm, her hands folded neatly as she poured tea for grieving parishioners or passed around hymn sheets with the serenity of someone untouched by scandal. But Miss Marple, who had observed too many masks over the years to be fooled by stillness, knew the depth of the silence now cloaking Lower Bramblecombe. The story circulating through the village was tidy. A young man, disturbed by a long-forgotten injustice involving his father and Beryl Lonscombe, had returned to seek vengeance through fear, whispering just enough to unnerve her, his intentions, spiraling beyond his control. His quiet capture had restored a certain sense of safety. Justice served, however unconventional the crime. But Miss Marple knew what the village did not, that it had not been his voice that ended Beryl's life. That another voice, gentler, more intimate, more devastating, had reached her last. Isabel had not confessed in so many words, not to the law at least. But to Miss Marple, there had been no doubt. A single whispered word. Plagiarist. Spoken through the old chimney system that connected the vicarage vestry to Beryl's crumbling parlour, had been the final weight on a frail heart already filled with regret and secrecy. That word, uttered not with malice, but disappointment, had done what no poison or dagger could. Miss Marple had shared the truth only with the Reverend Trowbridge, late that same evening, under the pale light of the vicarage study. The fire had crackled between them as he listened, jaw clenched in painful stillness. He had not spoken for a long time afterward. When he did, it was only to say, "I don't believe she understood the power of what she carried." And Miss Marple had nodded. "No," she'd replied. But she did carry it. No charges were ever brought against Isabel. There was no evidence to anchor the truth to law. Only whispers, overheard in rooms too old to swear to anything out loud. But the vicar's wife did not resume her morning walks, nor did she play the piano for the harvest fair. In quiet ways, she removed herself. And the village, sensing something fragile and unspoken, did not question it. Still, Miss Marple could not quite put the matter to rest. She had grown used to mysteries wrapping themselves up in satisfying symmetry, revealing the mechanism behind the clock face. But this time, something remained unsettled, an element that didn't quite fit. One afternoon, a week after the young man's arrest, she received an envelope, plain, white, without a return address. Inside was a torn scrap of paper with a single line of blocky handwriting. Not the only whisper. There was no signature. The paper smelled faintly of cedar and something sharper. Metallic, almost. Miss Marple held it between gloved fingers and read it again. The warning, or was it a reminder, felt like the wind shifting direction. She spent that evening by the fire thinking, if the young man had not been working alone, and she had never quite believed he had, then who else had been whispering? Isabel had delivered the final blow, yes. But what if someone else had primed the canvas before she ever picked up the brush? Her mind returned to Mrs. Harriman, ferret-eyed, always observing, always muttering. She had claimed to have heard whispers early on, before anyone else had mentioned them aloud, and it was she who had first cast suspicion on the garden wall. She had been eager, almost too eager, to recount what she'd heard. And then there was Sylvia Caxton, sharp-tongued, brittle, and strangely quiet after Beryl's death. There had always been something rehearsed in her indignation. That marmalade quarrel hadn't erupted naturally. It had unfurled like something meant to be overheard, a performance staged in broad daylight. Miss Marple decided to call on Sylvia the next morning, not directly, not to interrogate, but to allow Sylvia's own nature to do the work. People revealed themselves in the rhythms of conversation more often than in confession. She brought with her a recipe for lemon curd and a small jar of preserved ginger. Sylvia met her at the door, impeccably dressed, her eyes carefully neutral. Jane, how thoughtful. I thought you might enjoy something sweeter, Miss Marple said with a soft smile, after all that bitterness. Sylvia led her inside without a word, the silence speaking volumes. They sat in the drawing room, and Sylvia served tea without asking how Miss Marple took it. It was lukewarm and weak, an oversight, or a calculated dismissal. I've been thinking of that morning at the church hall, Miss Marple said after a few pleasantries. So much seemed to hinge on that moment. The marmalade, the quarrel, Beryl's last public appearance, really. Sylvia's face didn't move. She wasn't exactly the heart of the village. No, but she was a fixture, like ivy, easy to overlook until it starts pulling down stone. Sylvia tilted her head. I suppose you think I wanted her dead. Oh no, Miss Marple said lightly. You wanted her humbled. That's a very different thing. But that sort of wanting, well, it often gets passed around like gossip. Others pick it up without asking whose it is. Sylvia's expression flickered. If you're suggesting I had anything to do with that boy's business. I'm not, Miss Marple said, setting her cup down. Though I do believe you helped light the stage. That quarrel? You baited her. You knew it would spread. And you knew she was hearing things already. But you didn't whisper, did you, Sylvia? You left that to others. Sylvia stood, arms tight across her chest. Isabel told you something. That's what this is. A woman like that, hiding behind hymnals. I don't think she meant to harm Beryl, Miss Marple said. And I don't think you did either. But neither of you were alone in shaping the storm. Sylvia's voice dropped to a whisper. She destroyed someone I loved. Miss Marple met her gaze. Yes, I rather thought it might be that. Sylvia's lip trembled, just once. My brother, Arthur Bain. Sylvia gave a small, ragged laugh. You really don't miss much, do you? No, Miss Marple said gently. Only what I allow myself to overlook. Arthur Bain, Miss Marple remembered now, had been a critic, briefly, before his reputation had dissolved under the weight of a scandal involving plagiarism and false accusations. It had been a quiet scandal, buried with the help of publishers and family names, but Beryl Lonscombe had been one of those names. And now the circle closed. Miss Marple stood, brushing the hem of her coat. Good day, Sylvia. At the door, Sylvia hesitated. If I did anything, if I stirred something, I didn't know it would end in death. I believe you, Miss Marple said softly. But that doesn't mean you weren't part of the echo. As she left the house and stepped once more into the bracing morning air, Miss Marple felt the pieces settling into place. A whisper had killed Beryl Lonscombe, but it hadn't been one voice. It had been many. Some subtle, some sharp, some carrying grief from decades past, some dressed in love, some in justice, and some in bitterness, preserved like marmalade on an untouched shelf. And the walls of Lower Bramblecombe had carried them all. It was nearly a week later when the last whisper came. By then, the village of Lower Bramblecombe had begun, in its gentle English way, to reshape itself around the memory of Beryl Lonscombe's death. There had been the customary tribute at the church, modest flowers, murmured prayers, a reading from Corinthians, and afterward, a rather subdued tea in the church hall where everyone avoided using the word murder and instead relied on well-worn phrases like poor woman and such a pity, and all very mysterious, really. Miss Marple had attended, of course, dressed in her usual subdued woolens, nodding at the right moments, sipping weak tea from a chipped floral cup. But her thoughts were not with the biscuits or the quiet murmurs around her. They were elsewhere, back at Beryl's garden wall, at the dark flue in the old blacksmith's cottage, at the half-said things that still hadn't quite settled into clarity. She had begun to think, with a kind of reluctant finality, that the matter was finished. Not neatly tied with a bow, but with as much resolution as one could expect in real life, where justice came not in declarations, but in whispered truths half buried under years of silence. The young man, Jonathan Bain, now officially named, remained in custody pending psychological evaluation. Sylvia Caxton had retreated behind the polite curtain of family illness, and Isabel Trowbridge had taken to spending her days quietly tending the flower beds behind the vicarage, as if atonement could be grown from soil. But Miss Marple, despite her mild manner and softly creased smile, had learned never to trust a silence too quickly. It was the nature of echoes, after all. They returned, sometimes faintly, sometimes in new voices. The whisper came not through stone this time, but through ink. It arrived in a brown envelope, posted through her letterbox in the late afternoon. There was no return address. The postmark had been smudged, and the paper inside was thick, textured, and cut with a fine hand. She unfolded it slowly, standing by the little writing table near the window, the sunlight slanting across her slippers. There were only 6 words written in neat, deliberate cursive. You never found the real one. She read it once, then again, then closed the curtains and sat down. The note was not meant to provoke fear. No threats, no anger, just certainty. Cold, exacting certainty. For a long time she sat still, her hands resting lightly on her knees. Then she rose, fetched a small stack of envelopes from her desk drawer, and began sorting through them. Letters from the young man's solicitor, statements from the vicar, her own notes from each visit, each conversation. She pulled out one sheet in particular, a list she had written the night after Beryl's death. On it were names: Heron Isabel, Sylvia, Mrs. Harriman, Jonathan Bain. But now, as she stared at the page, she saw what she had missed. There was another name that had drifted through the edges of the investigation, like a thread no one had tugged: Francine Elwell. It had seemed unimportant at the time. A throwaway comment during the tea at Amelia Featherstone's, when someone had recalled that Beryl had once been engaged. Miss Marple remembered the exact phrasing now. Oh, it was ages ago. She was meant to marry that Elwell boy, wasn't she? But it all fell through. Some dreadful misunderstanding with another woman. Francine something. Francine Elwell. A widow now, living in the outskirts of Bramblecombe Heath, seldom seen in the village proper. It was her property, Miss Marple recalled, that shared the back boundary with Beryl's garden, ivy-covered, unkempt, and mostly forgotten, except by the trees and perhaps the wall. That evening, Miss Marple prepared herself to visit. It was a long walk to Elwell Cottage, the road narrowing and turning rough as the hedges grew wild. The cottage itself was shrouded in a dense curtain of trees, more shadow than structure, with only the faint glint of a weather vane catching what was left of the sun. She knocked once, then twice. The door opened slowly. A woman in her late 70s stood in the frame, dressed in a thick cardigan with her grey hair tied back in a loose scarf. Her expression was unreadable. "Miss Marple," she said after a pause, "you've come later than I thought you would. You were expecting me?" "I was expecting someone. Come in if you must." The cottage was dark inside, the air dry and faintly floral, lavender and something older. They sat across from one another in a room lined with books and shadow. "I understand you once knew Beryl Lonscombe," Miss Marple said gently. Francine Elwell gave a dry laugh. "Knew? Oh yes, in the way women know one another when there's only one man and too many years between them. You were engaged to Marcus Elwell," Francine finished. "We were both engaged to him at one point. She won, briefly, until he saw her for what she was, or perhaps until I helped him see it. It depends on how you tell the story." Miss Marple inclined her head slightly. "And you remained neighbours all these years?" "Oh, we never spoke," Francine said. "She liked her solitude, and I respected it. But I could still hear her, through the wall, talking to herself, reading her old drafts aloud sometimes. Especially in the last year, she knew someone was listening." Miss Marple waited. Silence stretched between them. "You whispered," she said quietly. Francine met her gaze. "Yes. Why?" "She ruined my life, Jane," Francine said, her voice low and even. "Marcus never forgave me for choosing revenge over trust. He left us both in the end. She published his letters in one of her wretched books, cloaked in fiction. He died alone in Florence. And so you frightened her," Number 1 reminded her. "With what?" Francine looked toward the fireplace, her face turned to the shadows. "I read the lines back to her, from her own book. The one where she writes about the man who never forgives the woman who sees him too clearly. I knew the rhythm of it. I knew it would echo." Miss Marple's voice was almost a whisper itself. "And you knew where to stand?" Francine nodded. "The old chimney flues connect. The sound travels. You can't hear a full conversation, but you can make a sentence into a ghost." Miss Marple stood, slow and certain. "You weren't the only whisperer, but you may have been the first." Francine's hands rested in her lap. "That's why I sent the note." Miss Marple's brows lifted gently. "I thought you ought to know," Francine said. "You solved everything but the part that mattered." "No," Miss Marple replied softly. "I simply hadn't written the last page." She left the cottage in silence. The evening air was cool, and the hedgerows murmured with the rustle of unseen things. As she made her way back to Lower Bramblecombe, Miss Marple allowed herself one small thought: that the death of Beryl Lonscombe had not been a single act of malice, nor even two. It had been a chorus, a quiet, methodical convergence of resentment, grief, and memory. Each voice not loud enough to kill, but all together, enough to overwhelm. In the end, it had been the wall itself, the old crumbling, whisper-carrying wall that bore the weight of all their intentions. And as Miss Marple passed it one last time on her walk home, she did not pause. because she had finally heard everything it had to say. The days that followed Miss Marple's visit to Francine Elwell were quiet. Not in the way peace feels, but in the way a clock sounds just before it strikes the hour. The village of Lower Bramblecombe returned to its rituals, with polite nods exchanged over garden gates, biscuits wrapped for church sales, and glances carefully averted from the ivy-covered corners of memory. But for Miss Marple, the matter had not ended with whispered confessions or inked warnings. Rather, the circle of it, the echo, remained incomplete. Beryl Lonscombe had died from something deeper than fear. It was not a single whisper that had crushed her heart, but a concerted chorus, layered, deliberate, spread across nights and years, and regrets. Jonathan Bain, Isabel Trowbridge, Sylvia Caxton, and Francine Elwell had each laid a stone in the wall of pressure that finally collapsed. But someone had removed a stone too. There had been one more presence, one that hadn't spoken aloud, but had known far more than they should have. And Miss Marple, sitting in her parlour that morning with her knitting untouched in her lap, finally let herself name it. Mrs. Amelia Featherstone. She had been the first to rally calm after Beryl's death, to keep the mother's circle running, to suggest tea and reflection and the language of polite distraction. But Miss Marple had long known that those who comfort too quickly often do so to avoid the stain of questions. And Amelia, smiling behind china cups and shortbread, had known too much, too soon. Miss Marple walked to Featherstone House just before noon, beneath a sky of pale linen grey. The hedgerows were losing their leaves. The village, as always in October, was preparing itself for winter in layers. Wool, root vegetables, silence. Amelia answered the door in an apron dusted with flour and the faintest tremor in her right hand. "Jane, how perfectly timed. I've just taken the scones out." "I wouldn't dream of refusing one," Miss Marple said gently, "though I confess I came for something else entirely." "Oh?" Amelia's smile didn't fade, but her posture stiffened. Miss Marple waited until they were seated in the kitchen, tea poured, butter cooling in its dish. Then she said quite calmly, "Did you ever tell anyone about the hollow bricks?" The clink of the butter knife against the plate was very slight, but noticeable. "I beg your pardon?" Amelia asked. "Behind the old fireplace in the church hall, there's a section of hollow brick in the chimney shaft. You discovered it years ago, I believe, during the renovation drive. You told me once quite proudly how you'd asked for donations to repair it." "That was ages ago," Amelia said, "and it wasn't dangerous." "No," Miss Marple agreed, "but useful if someone wanted to test how sound travels through walls." Silence now, deeper than before. Amelia folded her hands in her lap. "It's not what you think." "I think," Miss Marple said, "that you cared for Beryl more than most realized, that you were once friends, even close, that perhaps you felt betrayed by the things she wrote, stories she based on real people, real scandals, including yours." "She put my husband into one of those dreadful books," Amelia said at last. Her voice was low, flat. "Changed his name, yes, but the story was the same. The affair, the debts, everything. Our marriage nearly didn't survive." "I know," Miss Marple said, gently, "and I believe Beryl never apologized." "She said it was fiction," Amelia whispered. "She said if I recognized it, that was my own guilty conscience." "And so," Miss Marple said, "you joined the whispering." "I never meant to hurt her," Amelia said quickly. "Only to disturb her a little. Remind her. I never thought the others, Francine, Isabel, would join in. And then that boy appeared asking about her books. I thought he'd shame her, not destroy her." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "But you were the one who started it. You knew how sound carried through the walls. You planted the idea. You spoke first." A long pause passed between them. "I said her name," Amelia whispered. "Just once, that's all. Into the flue. I just wanted her to wonder who remembered." "And then the others followed," Miss Marple said. each for their own reason, none of them knowing they weren't the only one. Amelia's eyes filled. I didn't mean for it to become a conspiracy, but it was like watching an avalanche begin from one small stone. Miss Marple reached across the table, gently covered Amelia's trembling hands with her own. She died believing her past had returned to judge her, she said softly. And in a way it had, not by one person, but many, each one placing a whisper like a finger on her shoulder. You did not kill her, Amelia, but you did not stop it either. Tears slipped silently down Amelia's cheeks. She was my friend, she said. Before the stories, before the books. We used to walk the fields, pick blackberries, laugh about the vicar's sermons. But when she started writing us into her novels, I hated her, and I never let go of it. Miss Marple stood, her voice quiet. None of us are proud of all our feelings, but we must own them all the same. Secrets whispered into stone tend to echo longer than we intend. She left Amelia sitting in the kitchen, the tea gone cold, the scones untouched. That night, for the first time in weeks, Miss Marple slept soundly. The case, if one could call it that, would never appear in the papers. There would be no inquest that named names, no public charges. Jonathan Bain remained in the custody of a private facility, his motives confused, his actions tragic. The rest, Isabel, Francine, Sylvia, Amelia, each lived on with what they had done and what they hadn't stopped. The truth Miss Marple had pieced together was too tangled for courtrooms and too delicate for gossip, but it was true nonetheless. The death of Beryl Lonscombe had not been one person's doing. It had been, in the end, a village affair. A quiet, layered vengeance that passed itself along like jam at a tea table, each person spooning out only what they thought they deserved to serve. And the village, like all old English villages, folded the truth neatly into itself and went on. But Miss Marple would remember, because walls may carry sound, but it is memory that carries meaning. And in her quiet cottage at the end of the lane, Miss Marple kept the last whisper folded in a drawer, beside her knitting, where it would stay until the echoes faded. The morning after Miss Marple visited Amelia Featherstone, the village of Lower Bramblecombe felt strangely weightless, as though a pressure in the air had lifted. The fog that had lingered for weeks had finally broken, replaced by a pale, watery sunlight that glinted across puddles and made the hedgerows sparkle as if rinsed clean. The quiet, heavy tension that had hung over the village lanes and behind the drawn curtains seemed to exhale. And yet Miss Marple, though composed as ever, did not feel at ease. There was no peace in knowing the truth when the truth could not be spoken aloud. She had long ago accepted that not all justice was legal, and not every crime carried the shape of a murder weapon. Sometimes harm came in whispers, scattered among people who didn't speak to one another, but thought alike without meaning to. What had happened to Beryl Lonscombe had not been plotted in a single drawing room, but built slowly, gesture by gesture, over time. A shared silence, a look exchanged, a word spoken in just the right place. She sat in her parlour late that morning, the fire trimmed, the kettle hissing gently on the hob. A letter lay unopened beside her cup, not anonymous this time. Addressed in a hand she recognised from years before, shaky but sharp, black ink on cream paper, sealed with a dark green wax circle she hadn't seen in decades. She opened it with a deliberate care. "My dear Miss Marple," it began. "Forgive the sudden note. You likely don't remember me, though we met many years ago, at a cousin's wedding in Midhurst, if I recall correctly. I had the pleasure of reading your name in a recent letter from Francine Elwell, who, as you may know, is my cousin. She wrote of recent events in Lower Bramblecombe, with a kind of grim poetry I found difficult to read but impossible to put down. Her words were circumspect, but enough. I write because I believe you have pieced together the heart of the matter, but not all of it. There is one more piece, and it is mine to offer." The signature at the bottom was familiar. Arthur Bain. She stared at it for a moment. Arthur Bain, brother to Jonathan Bain, the young man who had frightened Beryl with whispers. Arthur, the elder brother who had fallen into obscurity years ago after being quietly dismissed from the academic world. His was the name Beryl had allegedly built one of her lesser-known novels around: the failed scholar, the unreliable lover, the man whose reputation crumbled beneath the weight of a woman's cleverness. Miss Marple had noted his name once in her research, marked it in the margin of a page, then set it aside. Now, like a single thread pulled from a garment, it returned. She read the letter again, slower this time, noting the tone. Calm, not bitter, measured, but final. He lived in Dorset now, it said, had lived there quietly for 15 years, had no intention of disturbing the waters again. But he enclosed something in the envelope, a copy of a letter, yellowed with age, addressed from Beryl Lonscombe to a publisher. It had never been sent. It bore no postage, but the contents were damning in their way. I realize now that I took too much from Arthur, not just words, atmosphere, the rhythms of how he listened. I disguised it as fiction, but I see now it was theft by another name. If he ever reads this, tell him. I wrote it out of fear, not brilliance. I thought stealing a voice would help me keep mine. It didn't. No date, no apology, no forgiveness asked. But it was something. Miss Marple folded the letter and stared into the hearth, watching the embers pulse. It changed little in terms of fact, but in terms of meaning, it altered everything. Beryl had known, not just what she'd done, but whom it had hurt. She had not been oblivious. She had simply been silent. And silence, Miss Marple thought, had been at the heart of this entire affair. Everyone had been waiting for someone else to speak first. Later that day, she made one final visit. The walk to the blacksmith's cottage, now quiet, the Harpers away visiting relatives, took her past the garden wall once more. The ivy had thinned with the season. The smear near the rosebush had faded, but she noticed something she hadn't seen before: the outline of an old wire, once nailed to the stone and now hanging loose, as if once part of a makeshift trellis or, more curiously, a communication line. She made note of it. Not because it proved anything, but because details mattered, especially the ones left behind after everyone else stopped looking. She let herself into the back garden. No lock barred her. The cottage had been aired out for winter, curtains drawn, chimneys cleared. She walked the length of the garden, stood in the very spot Beryl would have heard the first whisper, and closed her eyes. Sound, Beryl once wrote, was the gentlest weapon, but in the right hands and the right place, it could bring down walls. Miss Marple imagined the voice, first Amelia's, then Francine's, then Isabel's, Jonathan's, Sylvia's, each one testing the air like tuning a violin string. And Beryl, hearing it all, not realizing that she was listening to a chorus of her own past coming to collect her. The case, if anyone in the village ever dared call it such, had now rippled out in every direction. Francine Elwell remained in her cottage, more reclusive than ever. Isabel Trowbridge continued tending the vicarage flowers, her hands always clean, her eyes shadowed by something unspoken. Sylvia Caxton resumed her usual committees, but no longer offered to host anything. Amelia Featherstone stayed behind the scenes, no longer chairing, but offering to advise quietly. And as for young Jonathan Bain, he would, in time, be released from the facility where he was held. He had committed no direct crime. The doctors would note a combination of grief, obsession, and unresolved trauma. The courts would agree. But Miss Marple had seen the deeper truth. Each of them had sent out a whisper, and none had expected it to reach a heart already cracked. On her way home, she passed by Beryl's grave. It had been placed modestly in the corner plot, under a chestnut tree, with a simple stone. No grand tribute, no literary quote. Just her name. And below it, the words, "She listened." Miss Marple paused there, one gloved hand resting on the edge of the iron gate. She stood in silence for a time, as the wind passed through the long grass and the trees stirred above. Then she turned and walked on, knowing there was one more thing to do. At home, she took out a fresh sheet of paper and wrote a single sentence at the top. The murder that was not murder. She wrote nothing else. She folded the paper once and tucked it into her diary, between the pages of the week that had just passed. She did not need to tell the story to anyone else, but she would remember. Because what happened to Beryl Lonscombe had been quieter than most crimes. No blood, no weapon, no one hand to hold accountable. Only sound, only memory, only the persistent weight of voices calling through brick. And she, Jane Marple, had followed the trail not of footprints, but of echoes, and found, at the end of it, not one killer, but many. Not one lie, but several truths, whispered just loud enough to kill. It was the following Sunday when the final thread revealed itself, not with ceremony or drama, but with a passing remark over lukewarm coffee in the church hall. The harvest service had just ended, and the congregation, still damp from the drizzle outside, clustered around the biscuit table, exchanging polite reflections on the sermon and the state of the roof slates. Miss Marple stood quietly beside the radiator, her gloves tucked into her bag, her mind not on the conversation around her, but on a single sentence from Arthur Bain's letter. I wrote it out of fear, not brilliance. That line had haunted her more than any whisper, more than any half-confession, because it revealed what all the others had tried so hard to ignore, that Beryl had known the truth long before the whispers began. She had known, and she had been afraid. She was pondering whether fear or guilt had led Beryl to isolate herself so thoroughly when she heard her name. Miss Marple. Jane. I don't believe you've met my cousin, have you? From Falmouth. This is Dr. Francis Lonscombe. Miss Marple turned, startled. The man who stood before her was tall, with a lean frame and wire-rimmed spectacles, his coat still speckled with rain. His eyes, grey, alert, studied her in the manner of a man who noticed more than he said. He offered a hand. I've heard a great deal about you, Miss Marple. My Aunt Beryl used to write to me about your garden, said your tulips were too proud to bloom in the same soil as hers. Miss Marple smiled. That does sound like Beryl. She took her gardening as seriously as her storytelling. Francis's smile faded slightly. She didn't write much in the end. I saw her only twice in the last 5 years. But her letters changed, became quieter. You were close once. He nodded. When I was a boy, she was the only one in the family who encouraged me to study literature instead of law. She gave me a notebook when I was 15, told me to write down everything I overheard, and warned me never to marry anyone who used the phrase, for your own good. Miss Marple watched him for a moment. Did she ever mention the others? The ones who came before you? He hesitated. My father, her brother, was not fond of her. He always said Beryl collected people the way others collect glass animals. Fascinating, but never handled gently. She collected their voices, Miss Marple said softly, and sometimes forgot they were still alive when she used them. Francis looked down at his hands. I read her books, all of them, but I only recently came across something odd. When clearing out her cottage, there's a locked drawer in her writing desk. Or rather, there was. I opened it. Miss Marple's brow lifted, just slightly. And what did you find? A manuscript, unpublished, untitled, half-finished, handwritten. He paused. And notes, pages of them, detailing characters, many clearly drawn from people in this village. Francine Elwell, Amelia Featherstone, even the vicar's wife, but she'd changed the names, given them other endings. Miss Marple said nothing, but her silence encouraged him. There was one page that stopped me. It described a woman haunted by voices, real ones. She begins to think someone is whispering outside her walls. She starts to lose sleep. She sees shadows that aren't there. And the final note, written in the margin, was this: make it ambiguous. Let them wonder if it's punishment or imagination. Miss Marple felt the chill then, not from the draughty hall or the cooling tea, but from the full weight of what had gone unsaid. Was it dated? She asked quietly. 6 months ago. She looked up at him, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. Then she said, Beryl wrote her own ending. Francis blinked. You mean she predicted? No, Miss Marple said, her voice steady. She anticipated. She provoked. I believe Beryl Lonscombe knew exactly what she was doing when she whispered first. Francis's expression changed, the pieces settling. You think she started it? I think, Miss Marple said slowly, that she heard Jonathan Bain was in the village, that she sensed the past circling back, and rather than waiting to be judged, she chose to light the match herself. She used the wall. She planted the seed of fear in the minds of those she'd wronged, and then she waited. But she died. Yes, Miss Marple said, but not by mistake, not entirely. The whispers that followed, Francine's, Amelia's, Isabel's, were not imagined, but they were born out of guilt, because she made them remember. She pulled them toward her with silence. She constructed the theatre, and they stepped into it. Francis stared past her, his face unreadable. I think she wanted it to come full circle, Miss Marple said gently. To force them all to hear what they once buried. Perhaps even to die with the dignity of control. She died of the fear she cultivated, yes, but also of the guilt she reawakened in others. That is a form of authorship too. He didn't speak for a moment. Then he said, I burned the manuscript. Miss Marple met his eyes. That was wise. She would have wanted it published, he said, but it didn't feel like a novel. It felt like a confession that knew it was being read, like she expected someone to find it and complete the story. She would have liked that, Miss Marple murmured. To be read, to be interpreted. She always preferred ambiguity to truth. Francis took a long breath. What do I tell them? The people in the village, those she involved. Nothing, Miss Marple said. They've each heard the whisper they were meant to hear. There's nothing more to say. She left the church hall shortly afterward. Outside, the mist had lifted entirely, and the lanes of Lower Bramblecombe glistened with the delicate clarity of a world just rinsed. The past, once echoed through brick and voice, now stood still. Miss Marple walked home slowly, her bag heavy with the silence of 10 people and the truth of one. Later that night, as the fire crackled low, she pulled out the piece of paper she'd once tucked into her diary. The murder that was not murder. She turned it over, and on the back, in her neat, deliberate hand, she wrote, or perhaps it was, just not the kind anyone would arrest. She folded it again, placed it beside the envelope from Arthur Bain, and turned out the lamp. There were no more whispers that night, only quiet. The true kind, the earned kind, the kind that follows understanding. The morning sun sifted softly through the lace curtains of Miss Marple's sitting room, casting a delicate pattern over her knitting basket, and the unopened letters that lay neatly stacked on the small table beside her favourite chair. Outside, Lower Bramblecombe stirred into another ordinary day, yet beneath its quiet surface, a subtle shift had taken place, one born not of force or fury, but of the gentle unravelling of secrets long held in the shadows. Miss Marple sat quietly, her pale blue eyes reflecting the calm determination that had guided her throughout this intricate web of whispered voices and half-hidden resentments. She was thinking not of the tragedy that had unfolded, but of the many lives, entangled in its wake. Jonathan Bain, whose grief had driven him to desperate measures. Isabel Trowbridge, whose whispered word had carried the weight of regret. Francine Elwell, who had sought to remind rather than to harm. Sylvia Caxton, whose bitterness had rippled beyond her intention. And Amelia Featherstone, who had tried to soften the sharp edges of memory, but unwittingly stoked the flames. All of them had played a part in a tragedy that was neither simple nor singular. A murder not by bloodshed, but by the quiet, relentless pressure of voices echoing through brick walls and human hearts. The villagers had spoken in hushed tones of the events, content to file the affair under mysterious but closed. But Miss Marple knew better. She had seen the truth with a clarity born of careful listening and patient observation. Beryl Lonscombe had been both victim and author of her own demise. She had summoned the whispers, drawn the circle tight, and in doing so, had sought to reclaim some control over a past she had never fully escaped. Miss Marple rose and walked to the window, gazing out over the garden where chrysanthemums now bloomed proudly in the autumn light. The village beyond seemed peaceful, its slate rooftops and winding lanes holding their breath as the seasons changed. Turning back, she took from her desk the folded note she had penned weeks before, the final acknowledgement of a case that was more about the human heart than the letter of the law. She smiled faintly, a softness in her eyes that belied the sharpness of her mind. The walls may carry sound, she whispered to herself, but it is memory that carries meaning. And with that, Miss Marple set down her pen and settled once more into her chair, content to let the echoes rest, knowing that some truths, once heard, can finally be laid to peace.